There are places in this world where the air feels heavier, where the shadows stretch a little longer, and where every creak of the floorboard sends a shiver down your spine. The house on the hill was one such place. It stood at the edge of town, hidden behind thick branches of trees that shielded it from prying eyes, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. I first noticed the house on a cold, cloudy afternoon when the sky was nothing but a blanket of gray. The roads were nearly empty, and the wind carried the scent of the distant sea. The town had long since abandoned the notion of this house being a home. It had been empty for decades, or so the locals said. No one dared to go near it, not out of any overt danger, but more because of an unsettling presence that seemed to emanate from within its walls. A sense of foreboding that no one could quite explain. I wasn't one to believe in old wives' tales or superstitions, but even as I stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, I felt an odd tug at my chest. It was a mixture of curiosity and fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what had once been there and what might still linger. The house had an odd charm to it, though. It was a crumbling Victorian mansion with ivy crawling up its sides and a rickety porch that seemed to sag beneath the weight of time. Windows lined the front, their glass warped and cracked, but a faint light still filtered through, giving the house an eerie, ethereal glow. It was almost as if it were alive, breathing, waiting for something or someone. There was a peculiar feeling in the air as I stepped through the rusted gate. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're about to do something you know you shouldn't, something that might change everything. But at that moment, I didn't care. I had always been someone who thrived on adventure, who found meaning in the unknown. And this house, with all its secrets, seemed like it was waiting for me to uncover them. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind, as though inviting me in. I pushed it open and stepped inside, immediately hit by the stale air and the thick dust that had settled over everything. The wooden floors groaned under my feet as I ventured further into the foyer, which was adorned with old furniture draped in white sheets. The grand staircase loomed before me, its rails twisted and worn with age. Yet, there was something majestic about the house, something that made you feel as though you had crossed a threshold into another time, another world. I wandered through the first floor, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. My fingers brushed against the faded wallpaper, and I noticed how delicate and thin the fabric of the walls had become, as though the house itself were deteriorating, yet somehow still holding on, clinging to life. Then I found it, on the far side of the house, in a room that seemed untouched by time. A small, dimly lit space, with a single window that looked out into the overgrown garden. And there, on the floor, was a red cloth. It lay in the center of the room, neatly folded, as though it had been placed there with care. The color of the fabric was a deep crimson, and despite its faded appearance, it still held an unsettling vibrancy. It wasn't just any cloth, it looked almost alive. The edges were frayed, the corners slightly curled, as though the fabric had seen years of wear and yet had somehow avoided the ravages of time. I didn't understand why, but something about the cloth drew me in. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was as if it was waiting for me to touch it, to claim it. An overwhelming urge to pick it up swept over me. My heart began to beat faster, and a strange sensation settled in my chest, like a storm was building just beneath the surface. Despite my unease, I found myself walking toward the cloth. My breath quickened, and my hands trembled slightly as I knelt down beside it. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the shadows in the room stretching as though they were reaching out for me. As I reached out and touched the cloth, an electric shock ran through my fingertips, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and yet it felt strangely familiar. I quickly pulled my hand back, but the sensation lingered, like a lingering whisper in the back of my mind. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the cloth, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But then, a sudden movement caught my eye. Something flickered in the corner of the room, just at the edge of my vision. I turned, but the room was empty, save for the red cloth and the shadows that seemed to gather more densely in the corners. The air felt thicker now, oppressive. I knew then that I wasn't alone. The house, this forsaken place, wasn't as empty as it appeared. It was watching me, I had come to the heart of something old and forgotten, something that hadn't been meant for the curious eyes of people like me. Suddenly, a voice echoed from somewhere deep within the house, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, clearer, and before I could make sense of it, the words became distinct. "You should not have come." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't human. It had a strange, unnatural quality to it, like it had come from somewhere far beyond this place. I turned toward the door, but it was gone, replaced by the heavy silence that had enveloped the house once more. The only sound now was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway, its hands frozen at 3:15. For a moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do next. The house had felt alive before, but now it felt like something darker was lurking just beneath the surface. Something ancient waiting for me to slip up. But I had already touched the cloth, and I couldn't go back now. I stood frozen, my hands still hovering over the red cloth. The house around me felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the air itself had thickened in response to my actions. The voice that echoed through the halls still lingered in my mind, its warning resonating with a strange urgency. "You should not have come." I tried to shake the feeling of dread that crept up my spine, but it was as if the house itself had taken hold of me, its grip tightening with every passing moment. I had no idea what I had stumbled into. In the brief silence that followed the voice, my mind raced, struggling to understand what was happening. Was it a prank? Some leftover sound from a past inhabitant? Perhaps the remnants of someone who had lived here long ago? Or was it something far worse? Something that no amount of reason or explanation could account for? With a shaky breath, I forced myself to move. I stepped back from the cloth, my heart pounding in my chest. The house seemed to exhale with me, the walls groaning slightly, as if they too were breathing in the moment of tension. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting across the once beautiful furniture covered in layers of dust and decay. Nothing had changed except for the feeling in the air. Still, I couldn't shake the pull of the cloth. It was as though it beckoned me, and my curiosity, my insatiable need to understand, to know what it was about this object that had caused such a shift in the atmosphere, was impossible to resist. Slowly, I bent down once more, reaching out to touch it. As my fingers brushed the edge of the cloth, something unexplainable happened. The air in the room grew colder still. My breath became visible, fogging up in front of me, though the rest of the house remained warm. A tremor ran through my hand as I lifted the cloth, and the faintest whisper of movement made me look up, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. It was like a shadow passing too quickly to catch. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I was alone. "You're being paranoid," I told myself. "It's just a piece of cloth." But deep down, I knew there was more to this. I could feel it. There was something in the fabric itself, something ancient and foreboding, that stirred the hairs on the back of my neck. I stood there, holding the red cloth in my hands, staring at it as though it might change before my eyes. For a moment, it seemed perfectly ordinary, but then I noticed something I hadn't before. It was intricately woven, its fibers delicate yet strong, and the texture was unervingly smooth. It was as if the cloth had never been touched by time at all, as if it had been placed here only yesterday, still fresh and untouched by decay. I turned it over, and my breath caught in my throat. On the back, faintly etched into the fabric, were symbols. They were not like any writing I had ever seen. They twisted and spiraled into strange shapes, and as my eyes tried to make sense of them, a headache began to form at my temples. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly, as if they were alive, pulsing with an energy that radiated from the very fibers of the cloth. I dropped the fabric in a rush, stumbling backward, the room spinning around me. The symbols burned in my mind, leaving a haunting imprint. I could almost hear them whispering to me, calling my name, urging me to come closer. "Stop," I whispered to myself, shaking my head to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. I could feel my pulse racing in my chest, and I forced myself to breathe deeply. I needed to think. I needed to get out of this room. But before I could make a move, The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I froze. I tried the handle, but the door was locked, impossibly locked. I was trapped in the room with the red cloth and whatever dark forces it had brought with it. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. My breath turned to mist in the air, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, coming from the hallway outside. My heart hammered in my chest as I spun around, my eyes searching for a way out, but there was none. The room had become a prison, and the walls were closing in. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, listening intently, praying that whatever it was would go away. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was an old man, bent with age, his face wrinkled and gaunt. His eyes, however, were sharp and piercing, gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. He wore a long, dark cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows, and his hands were clasped in front of him, fingers twisted in a way that seemed unnatural. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice hoarse from fear. "What is this place?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on the red cloth, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his lips parted, and he spoke in a low, rasping voice. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said simply. I swallowed hard. "What is it? What's going on here?" The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the cloth. "That cloth," he said, "is not something to be trifled with. It has been here for centuries, and it has a history, one that no one should ever try to uncover." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. "What do you mean? Why was it here? What does it do?" His lips curled into a faint, almost sadistic smile. "It's a part of something much larger than you can understand. It's a symbol of what lies beyond this world. And if you've come this far, then you've already started down a path that will lead you to the very edge of reality itself." I backed away, the terror I had felt before returning tenfold. "I don't understand. What is this? Why are you telling me this?" The man took another slow step toward me. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because you are the next one to be chosen. The cloth chooses, you see. It knows when someone is ready to unravel the fabric of the world. And once you touch it, it will never let go." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The temperature in the room continued to drop, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I could feel the weight of the old man's presence pressing down on me, like I was being pulled into something dark and ancient. "What happens if I don't let go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then you will learn the truth," the old man said, his eyes glinting. "But be warned, some truths are better left unknown." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the words of the old man had taken hold of me. The room, the cloth, and the dark presence surrounding us. All of it seemed to close in, like the walls of a tomb. The old man's words echoed in my mind, his warning lingering like a shadow that wouldn't leave. "Once you touch it, it will never let go." His cold, calculating eyes watched me as if he were waiting for me to break, to succumb to whatever force had bound me to this cursed place. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows lengthening, curling around me like tendrils, tightening their grip. The air itself felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken secrets. I took a step back, my heart racing. The man's presence, though frail and old, was like a physical force, pushing me into the corner of the room. Every inch of the space felt charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. I needed to get out. I had to leave, but my feet refused to move. The old man stood motionless, his eyes locked onto mine, as if reading my very thoughts. I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me, like a puppet caught in the strings of an unseen force. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His lips curled into a smile that sent a chill straight through me. "I am nothing more than a keeper," he replied softly. "A keeper of knowledge, a keeper of secrets. I protect the truth from those who are unprepared to face it." His words were cryptic, but they stirred something deep within me. I had always been curious. I had always sought answers to questions that others were too afraid to ask. And yet, standing before this man, I felt a creeping sense of dread, a feeling that I had ventured too far into something I couldn't control. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice steadier now, though still laced with fear. "Why are you telling me this?" The old man sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Because you are part of a much larger story," he said, his voice low and haunted. "The cloth has chosen you, just as it has chosen countless others before you. And now you must play your part." I took a step forward, desperate for answers. "What do you mean, play my part? I don't even know what this cloth is. Why is it so important?" The old man's eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite place. Pity, perhaps, or amusement. "The cloth is a symbol," he said, his voice now taking on an almost reverent tone. "A symbol of the threshold between worlds. It is a thread woven through the fabric of reality itself, connecting this world to the one beyond. Those who come into contact with it are never the same. They are marked, chosen." I shook my head in disbelief. Marked? Chosen for what? The old man's expression grew somber. "For the truth." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. "The truth," I repeated, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. "What truth? What are you talking about?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The truth of the world you live in, and the world that lies just beyond your reach. The truth of what is hidden from your eyes. The truth of the darkness that surrounds you, that watches you, that has always been there." I stepped back, my mind reeling from his words. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but something inside me, something deep within my soul, urged me to stay. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I couldn't turn back now. Not after everything I had seen, everything I had touched. "You speak of darkness," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But what does it want with me?" The old man's gaze hardened. "The darkness doesn't want anything," he said bitterly. "It simply is. It exists in the spaces between, in the cracks that no one dares to look at. It waits, watching, biding its time. And those who seek it, those who find the red cloth, become its vessels." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Vessels," I echoed, my mind struggling to make sense of his words. "What do you mean?" "The cloth," he said, "is a doorway, a portal to something beyond your comprehension. Those who touch it become vessels for the power that resides within. Some are consumed by it, others are changed, but none leave unscathed." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, vibrating in time with my heartbeat. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, as if the very fabric of the house were alive, breathing. I felt a cold sweat bead on my forehead, my palms clammy as I tried to steady myself. "Why me?" I asked, my voice weak with fear. "Why did it choose me?" The old man's eyes softened, though his expression remained grave. "Because you are like all the others," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Curiosity runs deep in your blood. You've always sought answers, always sought the unknown. And the cloth knows that. It knows when someone is ready to see the truth." I shook my head. "I never asked for this," I said, my voice breaking. "I just wanted to know what happened to this place, to understand what was hidden here." The old man's lips tightened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. "None of us ever asked for this," he said softly. "But once the cloth chooses you, there is no going back." A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of my racing heartbeat and the faint creak of the floorboards. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, suffocating me. The old man's words were like a shackle, binding me to this cursed place. And the red cloth, the object that had brought me here, still lay in the corner, as though waiting for the next step in the ritual to unfold. "Is there any way to escape?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old man's expression hardened. "Once you've been marked, there is no escape. The cloth will follow you wherever you go. And when the time comes, It will take you to the place where the veil between worlds is thinnest. I stepped back, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever fate awaited me could catch up. But the old man's words kept echoing in my mind. The cloth will follow you. Where is this place? I asked, my voice shaky. The old man hesitated, his eyes darkening. It's not a place you can find with your eyes, he said cryptically. You'll know it when the time comes. The cloth will guide you, and when it does, you'll be forced to choose. Choose what? The old man's eyes flickered with a glint of something like recognition, something dark and knowing. You'll choose whether to accept the truth of what lies beyond, or to let it consume you. I took another step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The fear was overwhelming now, choking me, paralyzing me. I didn't want to know what he meant. I didn't want to be part of whatever dark, twisted fate awaited me. But there was no turning back now. The cloth had already chosen me, and whatever I did, wherever I went, it would follow. The weight of the old man's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Every breath I took felt strained, as if the atmosphere itself was thickening. His voice echoed in my mind, replaying over and over. Once the cloth chooses you, there is no going back. I stumbled back a few steps, trying to distance myself from the suffocating reality that had taken root around me. My heart raced with a frantic urgency, and my breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The red cloth, this cursed piece of fabric, was no longer just a relic of the past. It was alive, somehow, pulsing with a dark, insidious energy, pulling me deeper into its web. The old man watched me closely, his eyes never leaving mine, studying my every move. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to break down, to plead for mercy, or if he simply found my fear amusing. Either way, I knew there was no escaping it. What happens now? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. What do I do? The old man's gaze softened, though it was clear that his sympathy didn't extend to the situation I found myself in. There is nothing you can do but wait, he said gravely. The cloth has marked you, and the path has already been set in motion. You must follow it to the end. I shook my head, the cold sweat on my brow threatening to make my vision blur. No, I can't. I won't. He took a step forward, his movements deliberate and slow. His presence, though frail, was overpowering. You don't have a choice, he said simply. The cloth doesn't care for your resistance. It has already chosen you, and once it has made its mark, it will not let you go. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest, and my legs began to tremble beneath me. I tried to move, to flee the room, but the door was still shut tight, locked as if the house itself were keeping me trapped inside. My mind raced, trying to think of some way to escape, some way to break free from this nightmare that seemed to be closing in around me. But there was nothing. I was caught in a snare of my own making. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as I struggled to breathe. The red cloth, still resting on the floor where I had dropped it, seemed to grow more vivid, more tangible, as if it were feeding off my fear. I couldn't look away from it. The fabric seemed to shimmer in the dim light, the strange symbols etched into it pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly energy. I didn't want to touch it again. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. But no matter how hard I tried to tear my eyes away, I was drawn to it. Something inside me, some primal instinct, was telling me that I had to understand it, had to know what it was. I couldn't explain it, but the need to uncover its secrets was overpowering. You must go. The old man's voice broke through my thoughts, his tone insistent. Go to the place where the cloth will lead you. What place? I asked, my voice shaking. Where? The old man's face grew more somber, his eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and resignation. You'll know when the time comes, he said cryptically. The cloth will guide you, and when it does, you will be faced with a choice, one that will determine everything. Choose what? I asked, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I was desperate for answers, for any kind of clarity in this chaos. What choice? But the old man didn't respond. He turned his gaze toward the red cloth, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something like recognition in his eyes. Something dark, something ancient. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "The cloth will guide you," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when it does, you will face the truth of what lies beyond the veil." The air grew thick with tension, and I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked at the cloth again, and for the first time I noticed something different. The symbols on it had changed. They were no longer just faint markings. They were clearer now, more defined, as if they were coming to life before my eyes. I reached out, despite every instinct telling me to pull away. My hand trembled as I touched the cloth again, and as my fingers made contact with the fabric, a sharp, searing pain shot through my arm. I gasped, pulling my hand back, but it was too late. The pain spread, radiating through my veins like wildfire. I stumbled backward, clutching my arm as the room around me seemed to tilt and warp. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, creeping along the walls like living things, reaching out toward me. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. But it wasn't just the cold, it was the oppressive weight of something far worse. It was as though the very house itself was alive, breathing with me, reacting to my presence. I could hear faint whispers in the air, soft at first, like distant voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were all around me, filling my mind with 1,000 thoughts at once. It was like the fabric of reality itself was beginning to tear. "Listen," the old man's voice broke through the cacophony of whispers. "You must go now. The cloth will show you the way. But beware, it does not reveal everything at once. It will test you." "Test me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. I could barely hear myself over the whispers. "What kind of test?" "The test of your will," he said. "The test of your soul. It will ask you questions, and you must answer them truthfully. But be careful. If you lie, the consequences will be far worse than you can imagine." I tried to speak, to ask him more, but the words wouldn't come. The pain in my arm was unbearable now, and the room seemed to spin around me. I reached out, steadying myself against the wall, but it felt as though the very foundation of the house was shaking beneath my feet. The old man stepped back, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Go," he said softly. "The cloth is waiting for you." I didn't know what else to do. I had no choice. The cloth had already marked me, and now it was time to face whatever it was that awaited me. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord, drawn toward the cloth. As I reached it, I felt a jolt, as though something had snapped inside me. The room around me blurred, and the air seemed to hum with an ancient power. And then, as if guided by an invisible force, I picked up the red cloth. As my fingers touched the fabric of the red cloth, a sudden, blinding surge of energy shot through my body. It was as though every nerve, every fiber in my being was being pulled apart, stretched across an infinite plane. My heart raced, and my vision blurred, consumed by an overwhelming sense of disorientation. The world around me seemed to twist and distort, collapsing in on itself like the very fabric of reality had started to fray. I gasped for breath, but the air felt thick and stifling, and I couldn't seem to draw enough in to calm my panicked mind. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices all around me. I could hear them in my ears, in my thoughts, in my bones. They spoke in tongues I could not understand, their syllables twisted and foreign, echoing from every direction, filling my mind with a dizzying, maddening force. And through it all, I could feel the weight of the red cloth in my hands, pulsing with an energy that was both familiar and terrifying. Suddenly, the voices stopped. Silence fell upon me like a suffocating blanket, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was oppressive, a silence that made my skin crawl, a void where there should have been sound, a vacuum where the very air itself seemed to hold its breath. I looked around, but the room had disappeared. The house, the walls, the floor, everything was gone. There was only darkness, an endless abyss stretching out in all directions. I tried to speak, but my words were swallowed by the void. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in this unfamiliar place. You are where the cloth has led you, came a voice. It was not the old man. It was not anyone I knew. It was a voice that echoed from the depths of the abyss, rich with an ancient authority. You are at the edge of all things, I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest as the voice reverberated through my very being. Edge of what? The edge of reality, the voice replied, its tone heavy, almost weary. The threshold between what is known and what is hidden. The truth lies beyond, but so does the darkness. You will be tested. Tested? How? I demanded, my voice cracking in desperation. I don't understand. What truth are you talking about? The abyss around me shifted, and I felt the sensation of being pulled in every direction at once, like I was being stretched across the universe, pulled to distant corners of time and space. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I was no longer floating in the void. The darkness receded, revealing a new world, one that was both familiar and foreign. I was standing in the center of an ancient forest, its towering trees stretching up to an impossibly high sky. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath my feet was soft and damp. The silence was suffocating, yet there was something comforting about it, an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle in my bones. The red cloth was still in my hands, though it had changed. It was no longer just a piece of fabric. It had become something more. Its edges now glowed faintly, and the symbols etched into it pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light. As I held it, I could feel its energy, its power flowing through me, coursing through my veins like fire. You are here to face the truth. The voice spoke again, and this time, it seemed to come from everywhere. But first, you must understand what it is you seek. I looked around, my eyes wide with confusion. What do you want from me? The air around me shifted once more, and suddenly, I was no longer in the forest. Instead, I was standing at the edge of a vast chasm, a black abyss stretching endlessly before me. It was the same abyss I had felt earlier, but now it was real, tangible. A cold wind blew across my face, and I could hear the faint sound of something far below, something dark and endless, like the sound of a distant, terrible storm. The voice returned, deep and resonant, reverberating through the chasm. You are at the edge of all things. You must choose. Will you embrace the truth of what lies beyond the veil, or will you turn away from it and return to your world? I shook my head in disbelief. I don't know what you're asking. I don't know what's beyond the veil. What are you talking about? The voice seemed to sigh, though there was no sound. You already know. The cloth has chosen you because of your curiosity, your desire for truth. You have always sought answers, and now you must face the consequences of that search. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the darkness before me seemed to swirl, as if it were alive, pulling me toward it. I felt my body being drawn forward, as though the very essence of the void was calling to me, inviting me to step into its depths. No, I whispered, taking a step back. I can't. I don't want to. The voice, almost sympathetic now, responded. Fear is natural, but you cannot escape what is inevitable. The truth will come, whether you seek it or not. The question is not whether it will find you, but whether you will choose to face it. Choose and you will see. Choose and you will understand. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sensation of being pulled toward the chasm. The fear in my chest was suffocating, but deep down I knew the truth. I knew that this was what I had been searching for all along. The red cloth had chosen me not just because of my curiosity, but because I was ready to face the unknown, to understand the truth that lay beyond the veil. I opened my eyes and looked once more at the abyss. What will happen if I choose? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You will see what has always been hidden, the voice said softly. You will understand the nature of the world you live in, the forces that shape it, and the truths that lie buried beneath the surface. But be warned, the truth comes at a price. It is not a gift to be taken lightly. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The fear was still there, clawing at my insides, but it was no longer enough to stop me. I had come this far. The red cloth had chosen me, and I had no choice but to follow its path. "I choose," I said, my voice firm, though my heart pounded in my chest. The ground trembled again, and the darkness before me seemed to shift. I stepped forward, my body moving of its own accord, drawn to the chasm like a moth to a flame. And as I crossed the threshold into the unknown, I felt the world around me unravel, the threads of reality tearing apart, revealing the vast, infinite truth that lay beyond the veil. The red cloth pulsed with power in my hands, its symbols now shining brighter than ever, and I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within me, that I had made the right choice. The truth, for better or worse, was finally mine to see.